So before we get into some of the kind of content, I want to invite us into a little kind of meditative moment with you all. So as you're comfortable, get comfortable in your chair. If you are, I'm going to do a little bit of a kind of imagination exercise with you. So if you're comfortable closing your eyes, you can. If you want to reflect as well. I would recommend starting with a couple of simple breaths. Out through your mouth. Repeat a few times. In your mind, I invite you to recollect or imagine the future, a time when you feel fully safe, at peace, and free. In that place, I would invite you to look around in that place that you recollect in or imagine. Feel this air with you. What do you see? What do you taste and smell? What do you hear? Take a few moments just to be there in your mind's eye, look around, feel what it feels like to feel that safety. Take another deep breath. Open your eyes, come back into the spot. I would love if anyone's willing to share where they went in their mind, their imagination. Anyone willing to share? Should glimpse of this all, get some safety? Thanks.
It's in my garden.
Garden with your dolphins. Thank you, Claire.
Grandma's house, living room.
Grandma's house, living room. Beautiful. Thank you. Others? Sure.
Parents' house around the interstate.
Parents' house around the interstate. Here and back there.
On a lake.
On a lake? What lake?
Any quiet place. Small.
Maybe one or two more that are asking you.
It wasn't a defined place, more like a room, kind of like a room with the walls, but it had the faces of my children. Everyone's in a peaceful, everybody's got peace going on.
That's true.
One of that in myself.
Yeah. Thank you. And what's
And it's with my kid. My friends like mom's in the car.
Okay. Love that. I have that number too. Great. Well, that's perfect. Thank you so much. On the notion of safety, so you know that I'm here where you all have been talking about mass incarceration, and you've been talking about what the history of these institutions are, and how they work, and why they work the way that they do. And I'm sorry, this thing is going to keep falling from me. We'll see if that works. What are those institutions typically known as in typical kind of public discourse, right? Public safety institutions, right? So we think about in the media and in governmental kind of speak, we're talking about jails, we're talking about prisons, we're talking about police forces, we're talking about public safety institutions. Now, one thing that I noticed, this is just anecdotal, but it's anecdotal every single time I do this, and I've done this exercise many times. One thing I notice is that when I ask you to imagine the place of utmost safety in your memory or in your mind or in the future even, that nobody actually mentions a prison, right? Nobody actually mentions the presence of police necessarily, like explicitly at least. And so I do this to kind of raise this kind of cognitive dissonance a little bit between the fact that in public imagination and discourse, these are called safety institutions, and the imagination exercise that we did rooted safety in a kind of a different place typically. So I heard nature, I heard relationship with animals and family and loved ones and children and parents. I heard the presence of food at a table. I heard different kinds of natural environments like we mentioned. So while it may seem like, well, when you talk about police and prisons and jails, you're talking about, that thing about, when people do bad stuff. And on the other hand, when you talk about safety in a personal way, that's different. I want to argue that those are actually should be thought of in very close proximity to each other. When we think about safety in the public and how we get to safe communities, that we should actually root in the exact things that you all told me about, which is relationship, people having access to the natural environment, to food, to resources, that is actually a way for us to think about where safety comes from, what it's built upon. So we'll get back to that more in a few moments, but first, I want to ask this question that you saw pop up a moment ago. Why do we have these institutions at all? I don't know if you've asked that question yet. I reviewed John's presentation from last week, which I thought was really helpful and introducing you to all to the subject. But yeah, give me some answers to this question. Why do they exist at all? Why do we have them? You don't have to have a brilliant answer.
To keep me safe.
To keep you safe, okay?
From bad people.
From bad people, okay? Other ways anyone might answer that question? Right here?
Like some sense of justice or consequence.
Justice or consequence, like for wrongdoing of some kind, right? What was that?
Like a punishment.
Punishment, right?
To keep order.
To keep order, yes. I saw another hand back here, I think.
I feel like it was kind of with the rise of city life that it became more of a thing because we were all crowded together. You're not out in the world.
Yeah.
You're talking nature and all that.
Uh-huh.
When you have that, it tends to.
Yeah, that's a good observation. Any other things to fill in on this? A deterrent, yeah. So to scare people from doing something bad. Was there another hand there? Yeah. Rehabilitation of some kind. Okay. So what I appreciate about all that is that there was a range of responses that pretty much cover the basis for what you hear when you ask the average person that question. All the way from there's a lot of bad people out there and we have to have someone to catch them and some place to put them in order for us to be safe, in order for there to be some sense of consequence or justice or punishment, in order for there to be order, in order for there to be possibly some rehabilitation of some kind. So a little bit of a kind of to go into the history briefly, which I know you have seen a little bit already last week, is that despite the fact that these institutions are referred to today typically as public safety institutions, safety for all of us was not front of mind for those who were creating those institutions, historically speaking. Today, we tend to assume that is kind of their function and that's how most people think about them today. But when they're created, which is about 400, 300 years ago, the first institutions that become what we know today start creeping into existence. The first prisons in the UK, does anyone know what segment of the population they housed? Or they confined, I should say?
The mentally ill or the poor?
The poor, which in some cases was mentally ill folks, yeah. So the first prisons existed to warehouse poor folks. Why? What's that about? Anyone have any knowledge or guesses as to why the first prisons almost exclusively just housed the poorest of the poor? And again, not housed in a dignified way, held captive.
They were debtors.
Debtors. Yeah. What's wrong with debt? Yeah, so this idea that debt is somehow an offense, that poverty is somehow an offense, there's this widespread idea that those who are at the bottom of the social and economic ladder are less proximate to God than the rest of us. And this is a popular notion that emerges, in fact, in part through some forms of religious reasoning. You can hear already that it's an implicitly religious idea that God is closer to those who are possessed of more wealth and further from those who are poor, who are seen as a source of disorder that must be contained in some way. And so you can, if you look to the historical record, which I do a little bit in my book, the architects, the legislators, all the people involved in creating these first institutions were not talking so much about safety. They were not even talking that much about law. They were actually talking primarily about order. And when they said order, what they meant was a hierarchical order. So some people are up here and some people are down here. You should stay in your place if you cross that line, the railroad tracks, however you want to, construe that line, then you need to be put back in your place. And you can take my word for it. You can also, look at the book. But this is just kind of what the historical record shows. And so in order to understand what we have today and why we have it, it's important to start here and to think a little bit about how we got here, because if we want to create something different than what we have, which I would assume a good deal of us would, then it's important to understand how we got here in the first place. So I'm going to talk a little bit in a moment about the kind of religious layers of meaning that inform the creation of these institutions. But before I do, a really quick, it's not that concise because it's one sentence, but these institutions, historically speaking, if we want to be precise, they came about via the systems of capitalism and colonialism, which were racial systems emerging out of the European context, as means of maintaining a hierarchical order based on whiteness and property. And you'll see that in the title of my book, Whiteness and Property Are Key. So we're talking about this moment when white supremacy emerges for the first time. There were people from Europe, but there weren't white people until the early 1700s. I don't know if everyone knows that. The idea of whiteness as an identity spanning European identities. You were French or English or German, but you weren't white until the 1700s. And property, which is an order that comes out of a capitalist order, where some people can enclose parts of land that were otherwise held in common and say, this is mine now, and if you were here before, you can't be here anymore. And that created people who moved into an urban context, actually. With the rise of capitalism, you have the rise of urban centers and wage labor and all these things that, especially early on, but I would argue still are quite exploitative in their nature, that make people, resort to forms of livelihood that maybe aren't legal, which is still the case today. If you're locked out of opportunity and you don't have access to resources and you don't have what you need and you don't have, therefore, the time and space to exist in quality relation with the people around you, then bad things start to happen. You start to hurt other people more readily and easily. And even if you're not hurting somebody, you're perceived often cases as hurting the social order itself. So a quick anecdote, some of you may be aware of this idea of the criminalization of homelessness. Has anyone kind of heard of that idea before, that if you're unhoused or homeless, that you maybe are subject to being kind of harassed or seen as a problem by law enforcement? That's something that happens like today, probably this morning, honestly. Like it happens every day in Nashville with folks who are downtown, typically, who don't have a place to live otherwise, who don't have a place to use the bathroom, sleep, eat, etc., who are often seen as a disruption of the kind of smooth tourist operating flow of energy and money, etc., downtown, that they need to be pushed out of the way. And so that is an old phenomenon going back to the beginning of these systems. And typically, police and prison institutions are those institutions that swoop in to deal with the problem of the people who are made to have nothing because of the way that the system works. So first of all, that'll be people who are dispossessed of property early on in an English context and in Europe. And then with time, it'll become non-white people, black people and indigenous people particularly, who are seen as not belonging in the way that people of European descent do. And so, historically speaking, this is what the purpose that these institutions have served. Now, of course, they are, you might say, well, aren't they dealing with people who are actually hurting people? And certainly they are. But they're also not dealing with the white propertied people who are also hurting people in a lot of cases. So the reason that you have so many non-white and poor folks still today, it's still in a lot of ways is an institution for warehousing poor folks and poor white and poor non-white and non-white folks of different classes. Not because those people are more prone to committing harm inherently, but because the system is more concerned with keeping a kind of order that is based still on class and race and things like that. Even if it's not the way that the institutions themselves talk, it's still, there's a line from a scientist who says, the purpose of an institution is what it does. I'll say it again, the purpose of an institution is what it does. So what does it do? It warehouses primarily poor and non-white folks. So that must be central to its function, its purpose. So you could say its purpose is to keep us all safe, but let me give you a line that I go back to all the time from a restorative justice practitioner out of New York City who has written extensively and practiced extensively in these non-punitive responses to violence in that context in New York. She says that if prisons kept us safe, the United States would be the safest nation in all of human history. And I hear chuckles because we know it's not. Like, this is clearly not the safest nation in all of human history. Why would it be the safest if that was true? Because the US incarcerates far beyond any other nation in all of human history. And you would think that if safety was the outcome of that we would be just incredibly safe. But we are not. Somebody, about 10 people 2 miles from my house were shot last night in North Nashville. It constitutes a mass shooting. With that number, one person died. I think one is in critical condition, and some of them were children. And so, this is not a safe society. That we could get into the reasons behind that. But the point that I want to make here is that if these institutions were doing what they say they're supposed to do, then we would be a lot safer than we are. So that leads us to think maybe that's not actually what they do. Maybe they don't actually promote the safety that we think they do. And let's just think about it like at a granular logistical level. When, in relation to, like, say somebody shoots somebody, like happened last night around 5 o'clock on Jefferson Street in North Nashville, when do the police arrive? Like before it happens or after? After. So the harm's already happened. When does the imprisonment happen in relation to the harm? Like after, right? So the harm's already happened. And there may be this sense of disruption of a cycle, but in fact, the way that these systems work is that it does very little to look into why did this happen in the first place? Like a courtroom is not a place where there's a lot of interest taken in why did this happen in the first place. It just cares about the facts of what happened, punishment that equals that, action, and then move on with it. The system actually, in fact, actively prevents the one who harms and the one who has been harmed from communicating, from having any kind of possibility of repair in a relational sense. And oftentimes for good reason, that you don't want to be in relationship with that person, but it also prevents the possibility even of any kind of repair, or even the person harmed getting a chance to tell them how they were hurt. They don't even get the chance typically to do that in a meaningful way. Did you have a hand?
Yeah, it's based on money.
Could you say more?
I don't have money to get a lawyer to lock my way out, whatever it is.
Yes, exactly. So hence why there's so many poor folks in prison is that the folks with more wealth, if they do something that is an offense against the law, they have the opportunity to pay for the kind of legal support that would get them out of a long sentence or even any sentence. Whereas most poor folks are dependent upon a public defender system of some kind with people who are overloaded with cases, and they just can't kind of, get you the representation you need to get you out. So you're often taking a plea deal and therefore spending more time etc. So, yes, very important point to make. And so, just thinking logistically about, again, when these institutions show up in a situation of harm, and again, assuming that harm has taken place, a lot of crimes, such as somebody trying to take a nap downtown in an alleyway because they were unable to sleep all night because they kept getting pushed around, like that's an offense. Like I'm not sure who that's hurting actually. And so, there are ranges of actual harm taking place on the legal code. But even if harm does take place, in my opinion, a system that is interested in why did this happen in the first place? What were the conditions that put you in a situation where this harm was more likely to happen? What were you not getting that made it more likely that you would end up hurting somebody else? How do we intervene in a way that makes sure that doesn't happen again, other than just keeping you in a cage? I use that word because my incarcerated friends use that word, a cage. They refer to imprisonment as a cage because that's a way that breaks through some of the desensitization we have around what a prison is. It ultimately is a kind of a human cage. And so if it's not interested in disrupting that pattern, but is only interested in just kind of like bringing people through a warehousing cycle, then it's going to almost guarantee that the person is pretty likely to offend again. It's going to guarantee that the person who was hurt doesn't get a lot of what they need to be well or to thrive. And it's just going to mean that it's just going to keep on happening again. So let me transition us a little bit into thinking about the kind of religious and theological and Christian context about this. Let me just ask you this. Why are y'all talking about this? This is a question for all of you, truly, to tell me, why are you, and if no one knows the answer, John can step in, but why are you all talking about this at a church? Like, why mass incarceration as a topic at a church?
Well, because we're all created in God's image. And so, like, when we're looking at people in a prison, I think God loves them just as much as he loves the rest of us.
Mm-hmm. Yes, so if we truly believe in the Imago Dei, that all are created in God's image, then that means everybody, even the ones in the cage and those outside of the cage. Yes.
Well, there's not justice in the system because if you've got the right resources, and you and I both have the same bent against other people, you got more resources, you're free, not dead.
Yeah. And so what's wrong with that in the context of a church? Like It's
not safe for everybody.
It's not safe for everybody, not just, like, is it somehow goes against a sense of God's vision for how things should be, in some way? Okay, good.
Our country says.
Or what?
Our country says.
Yeah.
Equality.
Oh, right, exactly. So even on that level, right. Mm-hmm. Other reasons why in a church you're talking about this, John?
In the Diocese of Nashville, I know of 2 people doing prison ministry on behalf of the diocese or parish, despite the fact that visiting those in prison is one of our corporal works of mercy. The criteria that Jesus lays out for who gets into heaven and who doesn't. That said, I think we don't even know how to visit a prison. We would have the first idea of how to show up and what kinds of support.
Right.
So even if we wanted to do a ministry, we have no idea what the system's like. It's invisible.
Right. And thank you for that. And, I like to often say it this way too, is that it's kind of abstract. There are prisons and jails here. Let's be more specific. Within a 15-minute drive, there are about 1,500 people living in cages, like within 15-minute drive of here. So that includes the men's maximum security prison and the women's prison, and also the DeBerry Special Needs Prison. There are also probably jails within that distance, so the number is actually probably more than 2,000. So yeah, even if nothing else, just geographically, the fact that this is taking place so close to us, but we don't really have any sense of how to get there, and that's by design, by the way, very much out of sight, out of mind. Does anyone know like which part of town even those prisons are located in? Which part? Northwest, yep. So the kind of northwest Nashville is where they are, out in the bend of the river, hence River Bend is the name of one of them. And way out there on on land where mostly it's industrial purposes, like a lot of warehouses and stuff out. You go past a bunch of warehouses to get to the prison, which is itself fascinating, right? If you think about the prison itself as a kind of warehouse. So there's the reasons, like, it doesn't align with our principles in some way, that there's this kind of mistreatment or dehumanization element involved. It doesn't align with national or Christian principles of equality. It doesn't align with kind of specifically like Catholic values, works of mercy. We don't even know how to get there. Is there, what about on the other side in terms of like, does our tradition, the Christian tradition broadly speaking, have any role in the creation of these institutions as far as you're aware?
I think there's like a sense of justice that some of us might be trying to wrestle with, like where you do something bad and there's bad consequences for it, and so mirroring that with also being compassionate to other humans is a bridge.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, but our tradition contains both ideas about punishment or consequence as well as ideas about compassion. So that's a good place to start. Any other reasons? Yeah.
I'm just thinking about Jesus dying on the cross. And he was innocent. He died for us. I don't know, there's something in.
Yes. Well, he, between two criminals, quote unquote, it's a state execution, it's a, there's somebody, a theologian who wrote a book called The Executed God to kind of clarify the ways in which Jesus' death resembles in some ways. There's actually a lot of artists too who have depicted Jesus in an electric chair, for instance, and other ways to kind of show, that there is something going on there with that connection. I know that last week John introduced the idea of a penitentiary as one place where you might see a little bit of religious language showing up. Penitence, right? Penitentiary. Let's get into that in a second. So what I want to start with, just kind of broadly speaking, is that our tradition, the Christian tradition broadly construed, speaks both against mass incarceration, and our tradition had a role in helping to create it. And that's the part that we're not as fond of talking about, and it's not as easy to talk about. You could also think about the fact that without European forms of Christianity, there would be no such thing as chattel slavery in the US. It was very much legitimated on the basis of Christian principle and theology throughout its time, from the beginning to the end. You had Christian ministers, Christian everybody, saying, God wants this, slaves obey your masters, it's all right there in the Bible. And then meanwhile, you miraculously had enslaved peoples, kidnapped from Africa, who were also finding in that tradition something liberating in a very different way than what their owners were saying. And so you have Christianity on both sides of this phenomenon, which is the case throughout history. When it comes to injustice, Christianity is often is complicit in the creation of systems in some stream of it, and then also a key force in envisioning a world without that injustice and helping to realize it. In fact, in the case particularly of chattel slavery, Harriet Tubman, nicknamed Moses, had visions of God who told her to do what she did. So, Christianity informs the abolitionism of the 19th century and earlier quite explicitly throughout. So, in order to talk about how the church's Christianity is complicit in this, and again, I think it's important, if we want to do the work as Christians, as Catholics, of creating a world in which there's not so much mass dehumanization of people, where we're even dealing with harm in more productive and generative and fruitful ways, where everybody gets what they need more than is currently the case. It's actually important to do the hard work of wrestling with the ways that our system, our tradition, might be a bit complicit, which again is not to say that it's all complicit, it's to say that there are resources and there are ways of inhabiting our tradition that actually are more liberating and more humanizing and more compassionate, etc. But a couple of the roots that we want to talk about for a few minutes is this idea, which comes in the biblical text in multiple places, including Romans 13, comes to mind, where this idea that the authorities are sanctioned by God to do what they do, so therefore obey the authorities, and in so doing you obey God. There's different ways to interpret that passage for sure. But out of that comes this theology through Augustine and others who will say that God gives the sword to the state to kind of defend the good from the wicked and to kind of maintain a sense of order in some way. And so some will derive the idea of a prison as being justified in that way, that God gives the sword in the form of the prison to the state to do God's work in the world. You'll even have theologians saying all kinds of things like, that Martin Luther, for instance, will say, refer to the state as God's hangmen, meaning execution, that they perform that the violence of the state, while unfortunate, is necessary and is therefore understood as a kind of divine violence, that they channel God's work in the world. You also have this notion, as I mentioned before, of predominantly poor folks and non-white folks being defined and kind of circumscribed and boxed in as being distant from God inherently, which I think still lasts to this day. Even if we pride ourselves as being past, the racism of the past, if you've kept your eyes open at all, you've seen that it's not quite the case, that there is still massive anti-black and other forms of racism going on today from the highest levels in society. And also this idea that, the lot that poor folks have in life is their own fault, and it's not up to me and it's not up to the state to come in and, save them and rescue them if they've just been lazy the whole time. That kind of narrative really persists, I think, in our time. Has anyone, heard these things in any way before? This is kind of somewhat familiar for some of us at least. I worked for a time for the Contributor street newspaper that is sold by unhoused folks in Nashville, where they make an income off of it. And oftentimes we would hear from people who would call and say, I saw one of your vendors had nail polish on, and I'm not going to give to that paper ever again, which is their way of saying they're that poor and they spend their money on painting their nails. How dare they? So it's this really paternalistic, you only deserve what I say you deserve, and you need to only be scraping by and not looking good in the process. And somebody would have a cell phone. They say, how do they afford a cell phone? I'm not going to give this paper again. Really disappointing things to hear from people based in this idea that if people are poor, it's their own fault. It's not the fault of any kind of inequality in a structural sense, and that they have what's coming to them, essentially, which is unfortunate and not reflective, in my opinion, of the gospel or the Jewish or Christian tradition at all. And then lastly, a big word, who can tell us what soteriology means? What is soteriology? Does anyone know? Theologians in the room? Never heard of it, John, yeah. Soteriology is it's a theory of salvation, of sin and salvation often, of what it means. And the tradition, as you may know, has many different things to say about what salvation means in a Christian sense. And so I want to tell you a little bit about what I, in my own studies and work, have found to be a kind of a stream of thought within the larger Christian tradition that narrows in on some ideas and some ways of thinking about who God is and what God does in salvation and what humans do in sin and salvation, that actually tells us a lot about the prison systems that we have today. So if I'm talking about the religious roots of incarceration, this is where I'm going to get into the weeds a little bit. Please stop me at any point if what I'm saying is not clear, but I'm going to try to go at a good pace as best I can. So there's lots of thinkers who channel this line of thinking. In my own work, I identify Augustine and Anselm and Calvin as these three thinkers who, about 400 to 500 years apart, kind of keep this continuity of thought. It doesn't start with Augustine. He's reading Paul and he's reading theologians before him. But there's these kind of key ideas, and we'll talk about how they end up materializing in what we see today. But first of all, what is sin? In this line of thinking, sin is, first of all, it's a state of corruption. It's not just this and that bad behavior. We're inheriting a state of being corrupted, being in sin. That then leads humans to refuse to be properly subject to a God figured in terms of a sovereign power. So you think about like Lord and King and sovereign, all this kind of language that we find in a lot of the biblical texts, that there's this idea that this God has what you need and gives you everything you need, but there's this refusal to be properly subject. So in Augustine, you'll hear about pride, turning in towards oneself and away from the God who gives you everything that you need. And that is the hierarchical element of sovereignty and a subject gets more pronounced as time goes on. Like Anselm in the medieval era will kind of accentuate that sovereignty and subject kind of relationship, where God is due a level of honor is kind of really important to him and to thinkers in that time, which continues on past his time. Now, the result of refusing to be properly subject, and again, this is to a life-giving, benevolent God who loves and gives us what we need, that results in a state of either indebtedness or condemnation. Both metaphors, both images are used throughout Scripture. Debt was brought up earlier, that you're in a state of debt, you're in a state of condemnation, and that in essence leads you to, naturally speaking, a state of captivity, meaning you're captive to sin, you're a slave to sin. Augustine will talk about, I groaned under the chains of my own making, basically, and I couldn't hear you over the rattle of the chains that I was trapped in because of my own sin that I chose. There's all kinds of images like that. He also will use images, interestingly, of slaves who run away and prisoners who refuse their subjection as emblematic of the state of sin. People who refuse the place that they are due, which is a state of being subject. And in this case, not to a ruthless dictator, but to a God who loves. But nevertheless, a God understood in terms of a kind of a king-like figure. And so that state of captivity that's the result of this whole chain of events is both captivity to sin, meaning you don't have the capacity on your own to do the good that God created us to do, but also that it leads inevitably to real captivity as a consequence of sin in the form of actual physical captivity in some way. So if that's, are you hanging with me at least like a little bit? Okay, hopefully. Please ask me if you've got questions. And so if this is what we're talking about with sin, I'm going to say a little bit more that it is, again, a condition that, theologically speaking, humans have willed for themselves. So that's why Augustine talks the way that he does, saying that I created these chains that I groan under. And the result of that is that the people who are holding the keys are really only doing their job, which is to say doing God's job for God. So there's this kind of innocence to the institutions who do that work of keeping people in the consequence of their sin, because it's what God wants according to this kind of line of reasoning. And by the way, Augustine says all kinds of things that seem to contradict this too. So again, this is one line of thinking. There's lots of images and metaphors and analogies deployed to make sense of what is God doing in salvation and what are humans' condition in the process. So if that's what sin is all about, refusal to be properly subject to a God who gives us what we need, and to whom we should be subject with honor and with giving the glory, etc. And salvation, you know what? This slide is basically a copy and paste. Don't look at that. Salvation is basically a return to a life-giving subjection of some kind. And I use the term subjection because of the work that it allows me to do in making sense of the institutions that emerge out of this thinking. But again, it's not subjection in the theological sense in a brutal or repressive way. It's kind of, God gives you what you need. You don't need to, like Adam and Eve, seek it for yourself. God gives it to you. And you should depend upon God for all of your needs and for the grace to do what you need to do and to be in relationship with God eternally. And so salvation in this line of thinking refers typically to some return to a state of being a subject to a sovereign, to existing in that kind of hierarchical order where humans are humans, meaning they're not God, and God is God. And that distinction is important to hold on to, because if that's not true, then God's not God, and all of this is not, real in some sense. And so there's a lot hinging on it. But nevertheless, salvation is often framed and thought of in terms of this kind of return to a proper subjection that therefore gives you what you need, that you didn't have before, or acting in a way that you weren't acting before. Let me pause before I get to that. Let me just pause to see if does anyone have any questions or observations or need for clarification? This is our most theoretical part. We're going to kind of hit the ground again in a moment.
It's a question in this line of thinking. Is this an inevitable outcome or this is a possible outcome?
That's a big question. I think it's a possible outcome, not inevitable. But yeah, I know. Because that starts to indict, aspects of our tradition in a way that feels uncomfortable. But I really appreciate you asking that because, for some people, there's something inherent to these Christian traditions that make it so that dehumanization is inevitable. But, so much of the rest of the tradition is about countering dehumanization and about countering subjection. I think part of where we get into trouble is where state power is seen as doing God's work in some way. And that's where you maybe start to get into some trouble, is because if God does all of that, and if the state is God's representative on earth to some extent, then a godlike presumption is being carried out through the mechanisms of punishment, etc. And so that's kind of where it gets a little bit tricky and hard to hold. And, we could spend a lot more time talking about that, but you have a hand too?
The military and the church. Vietnam, Korea, and now in Europe, and maybe in our country.
Could you say a little bit more? What you're kind of suggesting? I want to hear more.
Okay, you get drafted into the military in Vietnam. You get drunk, you get stoned, you get killed, a variety of things. You come back, there's mess, and they throw a little bit at you, and that's it. You still go out with a difficult life, with a bond you, addiction, and service. In our society.
Yeah, absolutely. So, these forms of state, and what's that? Yes. Yeah. Thank you for being explicit about that. There is a lot of this history is just full of the historical record is full of examples of the Catholic Church and other Christian institutions being very willing and ready partners in a lot of death making and inequality and harm. And yet again, not exclusively so. You had Catholics who were reciting the Lord's Prayer while they burned their draft card, and there's all kinds of other examples within every tradition of different ways of thinking. Okay, so how does the rubber meet the road in all of this? What are the abstract theological concepts? First of all, let me kind of trace in a super broad brushstroke way. Augustine is one of the most important theologians in the tradition. He becomes very influential. His work becomes super influential. He's an interpreter of the ones who came before. Paul, the rest of the scripture, but other theologians living after them as well. He is very influential in a way that creates the conditions for an Anselm to emerge. And all that thinking continues in the form of a Calvin and a Luther and all the others at the beginning of the modern era, who are very instrumental in influencing the formation of these new systems that we're talking about. So like the line of influence is very much there. It's in the water. You literally had theologians and legislators interacting all the time to talk about, on either side, the church and the state, like how they were forming their sense of order and their sense of morality in conversation with one another. So if you want to kind of make the parallel application to, and by the way, carceral is just a word for, things that are about incarceration. So it's a theory of salvation based on these kind of carceral ideas leads to, and it influences in some way, the actual execution of practice of these systems of subjection and things like that in the following ways. You can think about so many times people defined as criminal are defined in relation to the worst thing they've ever done, meaning you are the worst thing you've ever done, and are often reduced to that in society, which is why, people often don't go to prison actually because they're afraid of the monsters they're going to find there, because they're the worst thing that they've ever done, and that's the worst of the worst, and there's a reason they're there and we're here. And that's the kind of narrative that a lot of us are given and embrace to some extent if we're not careful. And so there's this idea of an inherent criminality as opposed to kind of circumstantial. That then leads to this refusal to be properly subject to the law, to the state who is derived from a divine kind of power and sanction. And that creates a sense of disorder that we can't tolerate. And there's different kinds of reasons people go to prison. Some of them more serious, some of them less in terms of the level of harm committed. But in any case, there's this sense of people who are inherently corrupted, have refused their proper subjection, their proper place in the social hierarchy, and have broken some rule, have harmed somebody. Excuse me. And so that means that, what's the answer to that? The answer to that in this framework is a return to the subjection that will put them on the right path in some way. The idea of paying debt to society, you've heard that phrase before probably, that people who are in prison are paying their debt to society. And you often hear people who, and I'm sure you'll hear next week hopefully from Raheem and others following that, who talk about, I got out, I'd already paid my debt to society, and here I am still struggling because the walls keep coming up and I can't get through, and the opportunity is being withheld from me, even though I already paid my debt. But the paying the debt idea, very theological. Anselm was all about understanding what salvation and sin are in terms of indebtedness and a payment of debt. You may have hymns or songs that you sing in the context of Christian worship that refer to the paying of debt and how we are freed by a paying of debt of some kind. So you hear that language, and it's not a mistake that we hear that language there in the prison context. And then also returning to one's place in a social, which is also to say kind of an extension of a divine hierarchy of some kind. So what do we mean by this? Let's get it specific for a few moments, and then we'll start to wrap it up here. In the early modern context, you would hear a lot about masterless men and women. That was commoners, poor folks, vagrants, beggars, people who used to live on common lands but then were pushed off of them. And masterless, it's always the phrase that was used in all the discourse by more elite people. And the idea was, in that frame of reference, this subjection idea, they were subject to nobody, at least according to the people who were observing them. And that was the problem with them. They were a source of disorder that had to be contained in some way, and was contained in pretty brutal ways, including by execution in some cases. You also have the penitentiary, where that's a picture of Eastern State Penitentiary in Philadelphia that I actually took on a tour about a decade ago of one of the cells there. And it's often framed as this place where people go to be alone with God and kind of reform from the inside out, and to kind of be alone with their thoughts and a Bible, and that produces a kind of reformed subject. But you literally had very intentional forms of dehumanization in these institutions, including entering in a burial shroud of sorts, in a kind of a ritual, a shaving of the head, a taking away of your name and being given a number. And there's all these forms of kind of a social death of sorts. And this wasn't accidental. You had chaplains and you had administrators and wardens literally saying, you can't have resurrection of the soul until they are put to death in some way. And so it's kind of a deliberate dehumanization in the name of a kind of theological, that is salvific in some way. You'll have Augustine in places saying, God, you strike to heal me. That this punishment is warranted and it's going to make me better. And so there's this, these abstract ideas end up taking the form of very concrete that wall people in. And then to kind of bring it up into the present a little bit more, at least more recently, mass incarceration as a phrase really is referring to the early 1970s, the rise in incarceration as a response to so many social problems that were emerging. And in the 1965 Watts Rebellion in Los Angeles, where it started with a police murder of a resident, a black resident, and then people kind of rose up in response to it with all kinds of frustrations about the economic conditions, et cetera. You had Billy Graham, the fundamentalist minister, evangelical, who would say at that time, while it was happening to a group of people in North Carolina, we need salvation from lawlessness, and that the police are going to be central to that. And he's very influential, as well as this culture of the thin blue line ideas. Anyone familiar with thin blue line idea? What's that refer to?
Well, it's the blue is the police, I'm
Right.
guessing, and that is our protect, that thin blue
Right.
line is our protection between the.
Exactly. Yep. So police embody this line between good and evil, and that kind of mindset is very active today. There's researchers who've done a lot of research in the kind of like communication channels of police today, who really understand their work in this frame of reference. And then lastly, Darren Wilson, the police officer in St. Louis who kills Michael Brown 10 years ago, in his testimony about why he did what he did, referring to Brown at one point, he said, "It looked like a demon," referring to Michael Brown, the young 18-year-old black man. And so you will hear that language a lot in discourse in police and prison context, of a kind of language that channels good and evil ideas. And so I'm at time here, I realize, and so what I want to kind of do is invite you, kind of end on an invitational note, to be thinking about, if the sources of safety, I want to go back to our very beginning, truly are rooted in people having relationship that's mutual and meaningful, and having access to resources and to having the things that they need, that is not just relevant to an intellectual or imagination spiritual exercise. It's relevant to how we make societies that actually are more safe, meaning people having what they need to thrive on the front end, as opposed to not having it and then ending up in a cage which just keeps the process repeating. So my invitational kind of closing is to invite you to be reflecting through this series on, where is Christ the King as a community situated to contribute to the making of a world where we're not dependent upon these systems of caging that are so dehumanizing and that actually are not promoting the kind of safety that we all deserve. Whether it's meeting people's needs in a material and spiritual way, or whether it's visiting those who are already at that point in the cycle of incarceration, which, as John said, is one of the essential works that we're invited into. So I really hope you'll be thinking concretely. I know a lot of this was kind of abstract, but it was trying to do the work of building a kind of edifice for understanding how we got here and how we can tap into those other elements of our traditions that speak a more liberating and humanizing word. So we're at time, right? Okay, thank you.